Book title: Madusa's Minds, Reflections of Ego version 1.0. Author: J.R. Wert. Chapter 52. Spiritual Snake Oil, Superficial Salvation in the Market of Misleading Myths. Alan Watts, a prominent philosopher and interpreter of Eastern philosophy, emphasized embracing both light and darkness as inherent parts of the human experience, rather than seeking to overcome darkness to reach enlightenment. He believed that good and evil, or light and dark, are interdependent and complementary aspects of existence, akin to the Taoist concept of yin and yang. In his lecture series, Out of Your Mind, Watts stressed the importance of, quote, going out of one's mind representing darkness, to fully appreciate, quote, coming to one's senses representing light. He explained, quote, to go out of your mind at least once a day is tremendously important, because by going out of your mind you come to your senses. In the wisdom of insecurity, Watts urged people to embrace insecurity, representing darkness, rather than fight it to better understand security, representing light. He noted, quote, the desire for security and the feeling of insecurity are the same thing. To hold your breath is to lose your breath. He advocated embracing both light and dark as part of the universe's non-dualistic play of contrasts, describing life as a form of play rather than categorizing conflicting forces. This idea was further expressed in the essence of Alan Watts. Quote, this is the real secret of life, to be completely engaged with what you are doing in the here and now, and instead of calling it work, realize it is play. His teachings emphasized the interdependence of opposites and the acceptance of contradictions and chaos, challenging Confucian ideas that aim to overcome darkness through strict moral cultivation. Watts' perspective promoted a broader understanding of life's complexities by embracing both light and dark as complementary parts of existence. Tying back to Chapter 18, Pseudologia Fantastica, Veils of Verity and the Subtle Art of Sprinkled Mendacity. This approach contrasts sharply with Confucian teachings, which emphasize moral cultivation, strict adherence to societal norms, and prioritize virtues like filial piety, righteousness, and wisdom to conquer negative traits, exemplified by the statement, if you make a mistake and do not correct it. This is called a mistake, from the Analects. In contrast, Watts embraced paradoxes rather than simply correcting faults. For example, he stated, quote, problems that remain persistently insoluble should always be suspected as questions asked in the wrong way from the book, on the taboo against knowing who you are. Watts suggested that wisdom lies in accepting contradictions, asserting that, quote, trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth from the wisdom of insecurity, while Confucianism stresses social harmony through well-defined rules and roles. Quote, let the ruler be a ruler, the subject a subject, the father a father, the son a son from the Analects, inversely. Watts advocated embracing chaos and unpredictability as part of the cosmic dance, claiming, quote, muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone from the way of Zen. His teachings stood in stark contrast to Confucianism's focus on ethical cultivation, moral integrity, and overcoming inner darkness through discipline and adherence to virtue. Critics argue that Watts' philosophy, which downplays strict moral cultivation in favor of embracing contradictions and paradoxes, encourages superficial spirituality, Zen Buddhism, in comparison, emphasizes rigorous self-inquiry under the strict guidance of a teacher to overcome delusions. Meanwhile, Taoism emphasizes alignment with the Tao through naturalness and spontaneity, while demanding genuine understanding rather than superficial engagement. Alan Watts' teachings, celebrated for their persuasiveness and focus on non-dualism, have drawn criticism for encouraging superficial spirituality and spiritual bypassing. His philosophy often aligns with personal, contextual, and relative truths rather than universal ones, which critics claim diverges from universally accepted spiritual principles. Understanding these critiques requires examining how superficial spirituality and spiritual bypassing can arise from his approach. Despite its popularity and appeal, superficial spirituality is characterized by shallow engagement with spiritual concepts, emphasizing the appearance of depth without embodying genuine transformation or maturity. It often involves adopting ideas that sound profound but remain disconnected from practical realities and the complexities of true personal growth. Spiritual bypassing, on the other hand, uses beliefs and practices to avoid confronting unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, or developmental tasks. This can include denial, avoidance, or rationalization of difficult emotions or life challenges through spiritual platitudes. Critics argue that Watt's captivating eloquence and emphasis on non-dualistic thinking, often rooted in Taoism and Zen Buddhism, exemplify superficial spirituality. He distilled profound Eastern philosophies into platitudes like, quote, going with the flow and, quote, living in the moment without sufficiently addressing the inner work required for transformation. His struggles with alcohol and relationships suggest that his teachings did not lead to personal transformation, and his reliance on alcohol to cope with challenges is seen as an example of spiritual bypassing in action. His teachings to embrace paradoxes and, quote, flow with life encourage listeners from confronting deep-rooted issues or the darker aspects of their psyche. Furthermore, Watt's teachings lack a clear ethical framework and dismiss traditional moral codes, potentially encouraging the avoidance of ethical and emotional challenges. While his ideas had a significant impact on students and followers, they sometimes led to detachment from worldly concerns and a neglect of practical responsibilities. The emphasis on living in the moment without a path to resolve deeper issues might discourage engagement in the challenging work of personal growth. Although Watts popularized Eastern spirituality in the West, his influence sometimes promoted superficial engagement, emphasizing platitudes over discipline. As a result, listeners were often drawn to the idealistic nature of his teachings, believing that peace could be achieved merely by shifting perspectives without recognizing the need for inner work. Known for introducing Eastern philosophy to the West, Watts led a fascinating but turbulent life marked by personal controversies that cast doubt on the consistency of his teachings. He struggled with alcohol addiction throughout much of his adult life, often becoming intoxicated in straining relationships and professional commitments. Tragically, he died in 1973 at age 58 due to complications related to alcohol abuse. In addition, Watts faced challenges in his personal relationships. He married 3 times and had several children, but his marital life was often fraught with infidelity and separations, straining relationships and not always aligning with the ideals of mindfulness and balance he espoused. Critics point out the disparity between his teachings on mindfulness, moderation, and living in the moment and his private struggles, while advocating for self-awareness, spiritual discipline, and transcending attachment. He grappled with fallout from alcoholism. This inconsistency between his public persona and private life led to accusations of hypocrisy, as critics argue that his struggles reflected a lack of commitment to the principles he preached. In Alan Watts' writings, many of his quotes reveal a tendency toward superficial spirituality and spiritual bypassing rather than promoting deeper transformative growth. For example, in The Wisdom of Insecurity, he wrote, quote, no valid plans for the future can be made by those who have no capacity for living now, urging readers to focus on the present moment while overlooking the importance of long-term planning for life's challenges. His call to, quote, plunge into change, move with it, and join the dance similarly frames acceptance of paradoxes as a simple solution while ignoring the rigorous work of ethical cultivation. In the book, On the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are, he asserted, quote, man suffers only because he takes seriously what the gods made for fun, downplaying the seriousness of suffering and encouraging a mindset that bypasses the inner work required for healing. Critics note that these quotes, and Watt's broader emphasis on paradoxical wisdom, cultivate a framework that encourages individuals to rationalize their struggles rather than confront deeper, unresolved issues. This approach can lead followers to rely on comforting platitudes instead of rigorous self-discipline and ethical work needed for genuine transformation. In analyzing and understanding different types of truths, pivotal for overcoming egoic delusions, a universal truth is a concept or fact believed to apply to all individuals or situations, regardless of context. An example would be all humans need food and water to survive. Alan Watts' teachings often downplayed the importance of moral cultivation, which is a universal truth in many spiritual traditions. For instance, Buddhism's Eightfold Path and Confucianism's ethical principles emphasize universal moral cultivation, a concept Watts largely neglected. While his teachings embraced non-duality and paradoxes, they did not adequately address universal human challenges like addiction or relational issues, problems that he personally struggled with. Instead of offering a path to overcome these issues, he glossed over them. His encouragement to, quote, live in the moment and go with the flow bypasses the universal truth that genuine personal growth often requires confronting uncomfortable emotions and unresolved issues. As Watts stated in The Wisdom of Insecurity, quote, no valid plans for the future can be made by those who have no capacity for living now. While this statement may resonate with some, it overlooks the universal truth that practical planning and confronting challenges are necessary for a balanced life. A personal truth is a belief or understanding specific to an individual, influenced by their experiences, perspectives, and cultural context. Watts often advocated for personal spiritual preferences over universal spiritual principles. His teachings reflect his preference for Eastern philosophy and rejection of conventional religious norms. He encouraged exploring spirituality subjectively, aligning with his personal truth that, quote, going out of your mind is crucial for growth. However, this is not universally applicable, as many find clarity and growth through structured practices. His statement, quote, to go out of your mind at least once a day is tremendously important because by going out of your mind you come to your senses. From his lecture series, Out of Your Mind, reflects his personal truth rather than a universal one. As, quote, going out of your mind may not lead to clarity for everyone, and also depending on one's interpretation can perpetuate, idealize, or justify substance or alcohol use as a mental escape from one's problems. Contextual truths, in contrast, are truths that hold only under certain conditions or within specific contexts. Watts' teachings on Zen and Taoism are contextual truths that apply mainly within those particular cultural contexts. However, he often presented these philosophies as universally applicable. He overlooked the importance of cultural differences, implying that Eastern philosophies could be adopted wholesale in the West without acknowledging the contextual nuances. His statement, quote, the only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance, from the wisdom of insecurity, might hold true in some contexts, such as Taoist spontaneity, but does not universally apply to cultures that value structure and planning. Relative truths are truths that are true relative to a particular frame of reference, perspective, or group. Watts emphasized that spirituality is relative to one's frame of reference, which aligns with the concept of relative truth. However, this approach often led to spiritual bypassing, as it disregarded universal principles. He downplayed traditional moral frameworks, advocating for a relativistic approach that could encourage ethical inconsistency. In the book, On the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are, he stated, quote, man suffers only because he takes seriously what the gods made for fun. This statement reflects a relativistic perspective, suggesting that suffering is merely a matter of perspective, which can bypass genuine emotional challenges. Subjective truth is based on personal feelings, tastes, or opinions. Here, Watts emphasized the importance of subjective experience, encouraging listeners to embrace their own personal truths. His teachings on living spontaneously and embracing paradoxes aligned with this idea of subjective truth, often sidelining the discipline required for deeper transformation. His statement, quote, trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth from The Wisdom of Insecurity, which encourages a subjective approach to self-definition, promoting fluidity over structured self-improvement, falsehoods or fallacies. On the other hand, are statements or beliefs that are factually incorrect or logically flawed. Watts sometimes implied that psychological struggles could be dismissed or minimized through perspective shifts, which can be misleading when addressing clinical issues like addiction, psychological traumas, and underlying neurological conditions or neurodegeneration. Critics argue that he presented a simplified version of Eastern philosophy that doesn't align with the deeper spiritual truths found in Zen or Taoism. His statement, quote, muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone from the way of Zen, reflects a fallacy that problems will resolve themselves through inaction. leading to spiritual bypassing rather than genuine growth. While Watt's teachings are eloquent and influential, they often deviate from universal truths and encourage spiritual bypassing through their superficial engagement with deeper spiritual principles. His philosophy aligns more closely with personal, relative, and subjective truths, presenting a compelling yet flawed framework that can mislead students into bypassing genuine inner work and ethical cultivation. This superficial spirituality can infect learners with an incomplete understanding of spiritual growth, twisting profound teachings into something that sounds enlightening but ultimately lacks the depth required for genuine transformation. Furthermore, the quote man suffers only because he takes seriously what the gods made for fun could be interpreted as promoting hedonism, often leading to greater suffering and contradicting most spiritual teachings, especially biblical ones. The Bible emphasizes humility, discipline, and the rejection of indulgence for spiritual gain. Watt's statement encourages a carefree attitude that ignores the consequences of excessive pleasure-seeking, ultimately undermining principles that advocate for transformation through overcoming destructive desires. Critics point out how these hedonistic tendencies deviate from the deeper moral frameworks found in traditional spiritual teachings, which prioritize self-discipline and long-term growth. The biblical concept of false idols warns against following individuals or ideas that lead people away from genuine spiritual truths and ethical living. Alan Watt's teachings can be interpreted as an example of this due to their emphasis on superficial spirituality and spiritual bypassing. This aligns with several biblical warnings, such as those found in Matthew 7.1, 5-20 from the New International Version, where Jesus says, "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit you will recognize them." Similarly, in Jeremiah 14:1-4, the Lord speaks against false prophets, stating, "The prophets are prophesying lies in my name. I have not sent them or appointed them or spoken to them. They are prophesying to you false visions, divinations, idolatries and the delusions of their own minds." In 1 Timothy, it says, "The Spirit clearly says that in later times some will abandon the faith and follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. Such teachings come through hypocritical liars, whose consciences have been seared as with a hot iron." These biblical warnings align with critiques of Alan Watt's teachings, which emphasize superficial spirituality and spiritual bypassing, where critics argue that Watt's emphasis on paradoxical wisdom and embracing change might appear profound at first, but ultimately diverges from a path of disciplined ethical growth, leading followers away from genuine spiritual transformation. When applying these biblical warnings to Watt's teachings, we find striking parallels with the description of a false prophet. Watt's teachings, while seeming profound, emphasize a superficial form of spirituality lacking the ethical depth of genuine spiritual traditions. His struggles with alcoholism and relationships reflect the biblical concept that a bad tree bears bad fruit, as he failed to embody the values he preached. He prophesied visions of enlightenment and liberation through paradoxes and, quote, "going with the flow," which can be interpreted as false visions leading people away from deeper spiritual truths. His teachings appear to idolize individual experience and personal preferences over universal spiritual principles such as compassion, integrity, and inner discipline. Moreover, Watt's lifestyle hypocrisy, particularly his alcoholism and marital issues, while teaching about mindfulness and balance, aligns with the biblical warning against hypocritical liars. His superficial teachings can be seen as corrupt, seared by his inability to address his unresolved issues, thereby misleading listeners. His teachings encourage people to focus on paradoxes and living in the moment without practical guidance for deeper inner work, leading followers to adopt a superficial understanding of spirituality that lacks ethical grounding. His philosophy of, quote, "going with the flow and living in the now" promotes spiritual bypassing by encouraging people to avoid confronting deeper issues. This bypassing aligns with the biblical idea of following deceiving spirits, leading people away from genuine transformation. Furthermore, Watts himself becomes a false idol, attracting followers through his eloquence and charismatic persona rather than genuine spiritual authority. His teachings prompt individuals to idolize personal spiritual preferences over universal truths, fostering a form of individualistic spirituality that neglects ethical and communal responsibilities. Ultimately, Alan Watts' teachings serve as a classic example of biblical warnings against false idols and false prophets. Despite their eloquence and superficial profundity, his teachings often emphasize superficial spirituality and encourage spiritual bypassing, leading people away from genuine transformation and ethical living.